Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you from Toronto, Canada. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss the Iran nuclear deal, but this time around, we're going to discuss Bernie Sanders, the Democratic presidential candidate, as you all well know, who has spoken about the fact that the United States should go back to that nuclear deal. This is not the first time, mind you, that he has mentioned this, or other Democratic presidential candidates have mentioned such a stance. Back in March of this year as well, 5 Democratic presidential candidates, including Sanders and Warren and others, also made the same stance, saying the U.S. should go back to the nuclear deal. Now, imagine, obviously, that there isn't much of a precedent of the U.S. ever walking back into a deal that it has left, and that too after a quote-unquote maximum pressure campaign of sanctions, etc., now in place against Iran. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our panelists who are joining us. We're joined now by Hans-Jakob Schindler, who is Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project New York and Berlin, former German official who has served in Iran between 2005 and 2011. He's joining us now from Berlin. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Ahmad Hashemi, who is a Washington, D.C.-based Iranian freelance journalist and an expert on the Middle East region and global geopolitical trends. Ahmad and Hans-Jakob, thank you both for your time today. Ahmad, I wanted to start with you and ask you, do you think it would be a good idea for the U.S. to go back to the nuclear deal?
Even if it's a good idea, I don't think it is possible. I don't think it is feasible. Even the 3 European members of the European parties of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and other countries party to this agreement, they believe that there needs to be some amendments, there needs to be some inclusion of other Iran's destructive activities, including its malign presence in the region, in the Middle East, as well as its ballistic missile program. So I don't think it is possible, even if I don't think that's a good idea, because maximum pressure is working, because Iran has shown that after it got the 150 billion freezed money from the United States. Of course, it was its own money, which was freezed before. But when Iran got that money from Obama administration, it increased the pay rate for the IRGC Quds Force member. It increased its activities in the region, in the Middle East, and Iran strengthened its sectarian and Shiite Sunni sectarianism in the region. So I don't think it's a good idea, even if it's possible, to go back to JCPOA.
I imagine the Iranians would argue, Ahmad, that they haven't really changed their stances from before or after the deal, in the sense that, you know, Iran is still standing strong, quote unquote, of course, in Iranian officials' eyes. And secondly, it's not bowing yet to the U.S., certainly.
It depends how you define the term standing strong and firm, because we see that Iran's, at least its efforts, and when it comes to sectarianism, Shiite Sunni sectarianism, it has received a serious blow. We see what is happening in Iraq and in Lebanon, and Iran's efforts are not as strong as before when it comes to suppressing the anti-Iran, or let's say anti-sectarian efforts of the Islamic Republic.
Very well. Let me go to Hans-Jakob then. Hans-Jakob, do you think that it would be a good idea for the U.S. to go back into the nuclear deal? I mean, I imagine the Europeans would be happy about that.
Well, yeah, let me look at this from a European perspective. So obviously, Bernie Sanders very clearly has made that proposal to distinguish himself as a Democrat from the Trump policy, which was the unilateral withdrawal and the maximum pressure campaign. So in a way, this was a political move rather than based on, I think, some tactical consideration on how to get to a better situation than we are now with regards to Iran. From a European perspective, of course, I would agree in general terms that it's difficult to go back to the deal because several aspects need to be considered. Number one, the Iranians have started a phased withdrawal from the deal in which they announce on a regular basis now, the last time was a couple of days ago, that they're no longer keeping to some of the provisions and restrictions that are in the deal. The first couple were simply because the international sanctions prevented them from continuing to export heavy water or continuing to export the excess enriched uranium. But now we are now in the realm where it really becomes a voluntary choice for the Iranians not to adhere to some of the provisions. So it's going to be very difficult to actually put the cat back in the bag from a European perspective to make Iran again adhere to those restrictions that they are no longer adhering to, number one. Also, it's going to be a very tricky political sell inside Iran for President Rouhani to argue for such reintroductions of the restrictions. The second part is, of course, that there would be a massive trust gap within Iran, because any new president would be seen as, the next president changing the policy. Now you had the Obama administration changing policy from the Bush administration. That lasted exactly until the end of the Obama presidency. Now it's the Trump presidency. Its policy would only last until Donald Trump is no longer president. So what is the expectation if you're talking about the multi-year deal? And the third aspect that is really difficult is Iran's regional posture, of course, which is a concern. And I don't think any presidential candidate, including a Democrat, would simply say, okay, we will take back everything that was said before by the Trump administration about the malign regional behavior, for which there is actually no dissent with the Europeans on the characterization of what the Iranians are doing. It's just a dissent on how to approach the nuclear issue with the United States. So that, I'm sure, would have to be included in a renegotiated deal, which wouldn't be negotiated because several of the aspects of the deal have already, by all intents and purposes, fallen apart.
Indeed. So on that point of renegotiation, Ahmad, I wonder, is that even possible? Because, there's been so much political capital lost on the part of Hassan Rouhani as the president of Iran, who basically, has, who put his entire presidency basis on this nuclear deal itself. Is it possible for Iran to really renegotiate, considering, as Hans-Jakob there said, there is now this trust deficit, right, where the Iranians or anybody really looking at the situation, objectively would say, can we trust a U.S. deal if signed under Trump for the next president after Trump, for example, to follow up on that, to even respect that, considering Trump walked away from this deal because it was an Obama deal, essentially?
So this is a reality. Yes, there's a huge situation of mistrust between the two parties, especially from Iranian side, and I don't think Iran is willing and ready to compromise the principles and the so-called values that is sticks to, including the enrichment issue as well as its regional expansionism. So I don't think it is possible. I don't think it is feasible. But on the other hand, we see that Iran is suffering greatly economically, and as it was the case in 2013 after 2015 when the JCPOA was reached. So we are in the same situation, and I think because of the economic suffering, Iran might be able to return to the negotiating table under certain circumstances, and that's why I think Iran is willing to so-called to get ready for the second heroic flexibility, as Iranian leadership calls it, as Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei called it in 2015, نرمش قهرمانانه, or heroic flexibility. But there needs to be some preconditions, and I don't think the preconditions are ready because the Trump administration is not trustable. The Trump administration is against international norms and rules and conventions, and he even breaks away with the allies, the Paris Climate Change Pact and different and NAFTA and others. So I don't think there's a willingness. Even if there's a willingness, I don't think there's a possibility that the two sides, Iran and the United States, come to a negotiating table. And besides, the maximum pressure is working, and the United States is getting what it's wanting from Iran, and that's the suffering. Of course, the people are suffering as well in Iran, but the government, we see that for the first time, the Hezbollah group in Lebanon, they are asking for donation, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and this was the same guy who a couple years ago said we are getting all the fundings, all the equipments and ammunition from Iran, and the situation is changing, and Iran is not able to help the proxy wars as before.
All right, so Hans-Jakob, I wonder what your perspective is, again, from the European point of view, because it's interesting, isn't it? As Ahmad there said as well, it is the Iranian people, ultimately, who are suffering through this maximum pressure campaign. I mean, of course, we can argue about the effect that this may be possibly having on Iran's regional role, as well as Ahmad there mentioned about Hezbollah and other funding to other groups, possibly across the region as well. But at the end of the day, it is Iranian people who are suffering as well. And it sort of seems like it goes back to earlier sanctions that had been placed before the nuclear deal even was agreed upon, which, again, may be termed in some way or the other collective punishment. I mean, it's not the Iranian people who apparently the world has a problem with, but it is with the Iranian government. So does this sort of policy really work in the long term?
Well, I mean, first let me say, I think this sanctions round is much harsher than the sanctions round before. There were a lot of lessons learned between 2011 to about 15 when the last sanctions round was, and the American administration has been very smart in implementing all those, i.e. closing all the loopholes that were discovered in that first sanctions episode. So I think the effect is much stronger. I don't think that anyone disputes that. That is unfortunately the nature of the tool of economic sanctions, because you're targeting the economy of another country in order to achieve a modification of that country's political leadership. So there is actually no other way than to do this if you want to use economic sanctions, which is one of the tools in the toolbox. So unfortunately, that is always going to be the case, that the economy is suffering, and if the economy is suffering, you're talking about the population of the country having a reduction in their living standards. That's what economic sanctions do. From a European perspective, I think one of the worrying signs, I mean, it's on the one hand tactically good, strategically rather worrying, is the apparent, at least for the last couple of weeks, success in Iran trying to re-regionalize this dispute, right? So after the attack on the Saudi Aramco facilities, for which I think by now it really is undisputed that Iran is responsible both politically and directly for this, there was an opening from the UAE and tentatively even from Saudi Arabia, and a put forward of what the Iranian government calls it the Hormuz peace plan. So this is an attempt of the Iranians to say, okay, let's, as a region, talk about this conflict. Obviously, that is not a particularly good development as far as Europe or America is concerned, because that would mean there would be some kind of a regional piecemeal deal, of which we would then have no stakes that our interests are maintained. So that complicates things, and there seems to be some success to it. Of course, this means there is at the moment a current de-escalation of the situation, which is not bad and is in everyone's interest. But should this fail, then of course those hardliners in Iran who were arguing for an escalation of the situation and were arguing for attacks as they has happened, who have seen their actions rewarded, unfortunately, would argue then very likely for even more escalation. So if it works, it's not perfect. If it doesn't work, it's even worse. So this is not a good track that we are on right now.
Very well. Happily, there's our final comment, but of course, we appreciate both of our guests for their time and, of course, their insight today. That was Hans-Jakob Schindler speaking to us from Berlin, and Ahmad Hashemi was speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Now, of course, this nuclear deal, viewers, of course, the U.S. was the one that originally violated it. Really, if we look at how this deal is designed, the U.S. is not the only party to this deal. It's not a bilateral agreement. It's a multilateral agreement that was reached, including the European countries, as well as Russia, China, and others. The U.S. violated it, and the Iranians now say, of course, that they're walking away from these commitments that they've made under that deal because the U.S. was originally the one that violated it. So they've been keeping strong to, of course, the deal till just recently, when they've started on a 2-month basis, walking away from specific commitments that they have made. They're nowhere close at this point in time, as we discussed yesterday, to nuclear weapons grade technology at this point in time. That may very well at some point happen in the future if this all falls apart. However, Iran has always maintained that this is just a nuclear energy program. Nevertheless, the sanctions in place right now are affecting the Iranian people the most. And one wonders if Bernie Sanders and other of these presidential candidates' advice that the U.S. go back into the deal isn't actually the best route. Because at the end of the day, this does then hurt the U.S. image worldwide about whether or not it can really ever be trusted when it signs any deal or any treaties with any countries, be they bilateral or multilateral. Who's to say that the next president will ever respect a deal signed today, for example, even under President Trump? That's a huge question mark at this point in time. We'll leave it there for now, though. I'll be back after this break with my next segment. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of the program, we're going to discuss the U.S. impeachment process for Donald Trump at this point in time. That seems to be picking up pace, especially with the recent comments that have come out specifically about the senior U.S. diplomat who has said that there was quid pro quo, that Donald Trump had very much connected aid to Ukraine to an investigation into the Bidens, specifically, of course, Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, and his dealings there with Ukraine, with the Ukrainian company, I should say. Now, of course, there are some divisions within the U.S. about whether this impeachment process is legitimate at this point in time. As you can well imagine, the president's own party, the Republicans, are not happy about this. Many Republicans, of course, saying that this is all just a witch hunt, as they had called the Russia collusion case also. And also, just before coming on air, in fact, I just saw a poll that's come out by the Los Angeles Times that shows around 44% of Americans say the House should vote to impeach, and 30% say it should not. But 26% then of Americans say they either don't know or that it's too soon, to tell at this point in time. That also is a very important statistic, because that means that voters can at this time be swayed either way, depending on the evidence that comes out. Will this latest statement by this senior U.S. diplomat be one that may sway voters onto the side of impeaching Donald Trump? Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Sascha Auerbach, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us now from London. Joining us from Boston is Brian E. Frydenborg, who is a writer, academic, and consultant who is originally based in the greater New York City area. Brian and Sascha, thank you both for your time today. Sascha, let me start with you. Do you think we're getting closer to actually impeaching Donald Trump?
That's a good question. We're moving to the public interviews with witnesses now, which is a very, very important step because this is all going to be televised nationally, and you're going to have a much larger array of witnesses. You're going to bring back the witnesses that were interviewed in camera, in private chambers, and this is going to become more political theater. In terms of whether we're closer to actually impeaching Trump, that is, say, removing him from office, to be honest, I don't think we're that much closer than we were when the process began. The math still does not favor it. The House of Representatives voted exactly along party lines, so the Democrats won that vote. In the Senate, if they vote along party lines, the Republicans will win, and Donald Trump won't be impeached.
What are your thoughts on that, Brian? Because again, this goes back to a very polarized situation, doesn't it, in the U.S., where society seems to be even more divided when it comes to this issue.
Well, it's incredibly divided, Waqar. And I think we can go back to the 2016 election, the campaign, when Donald Trump says he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and his supporters wouldn't care. And it's scary that we're at that point where we really are almost at that point. And I would just add, when it comes to the Senate inherently does not reflect the overall will of the people. It's a bit like the Electoral College. Almost 3 million more people did vote for Hillary Clinton. So the people chose her, but the system, and the system is legitimate, it chose Trump. So we have an imbalance there, and especially rural districts are overrepresented in the Senate. So I agree with my colleague Sascha that there's pretty much zero chance that there will be a conviction in the Senate. And the whole process of impeachment was designed to have overwhelming support for it. So you need 67 votes in the Senate. We're nowhere near that. However, as a matter of principle, it is still important. I think that, Hamilton, and you read what he had in mind when he and Madison were designing. And I think to them, they would, if there's not an impeachment in this situation, what's the mechanism designed for? What's the point of even having it? So impeachment can still make a point in a divided country. And the point of impeachment is to put the president on trial. And a lot of people get confused and they think impeachment is actually throwing a president out of office. Impeachment is simply the House telling the Senate, you have to take a look at this guy and look at him in a possibly remove him from office sense. But that doesn't mean he'll be removed from office. Impeachment's just the first step of a two-step process. So impeachment is very likely, but we're very divided. So yes, there's almost no chance he'll be convicted in the Senate.
Okay, let me add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Nicholas Mucerino, who is an independent analyst of international affairs with a focus on former Soviet Union and the Middle East. He's currently in New York. He's joining us from there. Nicholas, as always, thank you for your time. What do you make, Nicholas, of the impeachment process and where it's reached at this point in time? Is this a witch hunt, as Donald Trump has said?
So thanks for having me again, Waqar. And to answer your question, no, this is not a witch hunt by any means, despite the president's claims to the contrary. We have so far seen a number of depositions by members of his own National Security Council that he goes on to deride as members of a never Trump cabal or a quote unquote deep state. But all of the evidence has so far been pretty consistent that there was some sort of hold put over this military aid to Ukraine. And the reasons don't appear to lack any sort of justification and are based around a combination of smears that are originating from actors within the country itself, like the former deposed Ukrainian prosecutor that reached out to Rudy Giuliani and John Solomon, the conservative commentator on the Hill, where a lot of this all began, but then also with President Trump's own pre-existing beliefs that there was a nexus to what he believed was the coup attempt against him, which, of course, was not a coup, but he believed that it began in Ukraine and that they are biased against him in the first place. But bearing all of that in mind, this military aid was agreed to by Congress. We were required to provide it, but they put up a bunch of different barricades to delivering it, as highlighted by any number of the officials that have given testimony so far to Congress. And we're going to end up seeing that again reiterated in a public setting as the hearings move forward after the formal vote last week.
Sascha, I wanted to go to you and I wanted to ask you, I was reading an article today, I believe it was in the New Yorker, if I'm not mistaken, about how Donald Trump has very successfully always been able to use partisanship to his advantage. And this began really from day one of his candidacy, all the way then into when he came to the White House, and the Russia collusion case, etc. Always saying there was a witch hunt, that that there were the establishment and the Democrats were after him, etc. Do you think that he's actually succeeded this time around too, when it comes to this impeachment process about further dividing the country along those lines. And is that then is going to protect him, do you think, at some level?
Well, it's really hard to say, and this is where the real battle is going to be fought. Is it's not going to be fought over impeachment. I think everyone here, Brian and Nicholas, we're all in agreement that the likelihood of an actual conviction in the Senate is very, very, very small, unless there's a dramatic change of events. So where this battle is going to be fought is in the public domain. And a lot of very ugly things are going to come out about the way Trump conducts business and the way his proxies, like Giuliani, conduct business. Will Trump be able to spin that in a way that will convince not his base? His base will never abandon him. People like Rand Paul, Lindsey Graham, they have completely connected their own political destiny to Trump's. They will never abandon him. Some of his supporters might get thrown in jail as a result of contempt of Congress and a number of other crimes, but his voting base will never abandon him. The question is, how will moderates and undecideds in the upcoming election respond to this? Will he spin it convincingly enough to get them? If the recent electoral results in both Virginia and Kentucky are any sign, the moderates are already moving away from him in droves. And it's very likely that this incredibly partisan, very ugly public process will damage him far more than he's able to control. In the end, Trump is not, I don't think, a particularly clever man. He simply can bring things to the lowest possible level and appeal to people whose expectations are actually pretty low in terms of human dignity.
Brian, there has been this theory thrown around that if Donald Trump survives this entire impeachment process, which, again, it seems likely he may very well, that will only strengthen his support within his base. And as Sascha has there said, of course, we know that he's already said that he can do no wrong when it comes to his support base. Do you think that almost guarantees him a win in 2020? Or is it, too early to say, certainly, obviously, but looking into the crystal ball of the future, possibly, do you think that he would go into that strong if he comes out of this, without an impeachment?
Well, I would say there's a few factors to consider there. Number one, it's definitely a possibility he will be strengthened because he and his supporters and people undecided in the middle can say, well, you know what, the House impeached him and they tried that and it didn't work. At the same time, this is the really best chance the Democrats have to really shine a spotlight and focus on Trump's misdeeds and corruption. And if anyone will be moved, it will be by this process. So I'm kind of in the middle in the sense that I think impeachment could help him, but I think impeachment may also hurt him. It just depends how it's conducted, and it really ultimately depends on the minds of the voters, who are not as easy to predict as we hoped back in 2016. But I want to make another point where we're talking about the partisanship of this situation. Almost every piece of information that we have about Donald Trump's misdeeds when it came to this Ukraine situation with the president there, with this quote-unquote quid pro quo, it comes from people within his own executive branch. These are generally Republicans. Some of them have been appointed by him. Gordon Sondland didn't come out with a ringing endorsement to begin with. He was still trying to kind of align himself with William Taylor, the former ambassador. And you have this active duty military officer giving dramatic testimony saying, this is my duty to the Constitution. These are not far left wing quote unquote radical as the farcical statement from the White House press secretary said.
Brian, I'm going to cut you off just because we're quickly running out of time. I do apologize for doing that. I wanted to get the final comments, if you allow me, from Nicholas. Nicholas, tell us about what you think the next step in this process will be, because, for those of us watching from the outside, and certainly it's fascinating how this process moves forward anyhow. But with these public hearings set to begin, do you think a lot more revelations are around the corner? If you could keep that short, please.
Well, to be honest, anything is possible when it comes to this administration in terms of the revelations, especially if the Congress ultimately ends up succeeding in attaining subpoenas from figures such as Giuliani himself, who's contesting that with a lawsuit, or John Bolton, who's also expected to resist a subpoena released to him. But even there, it's already been the comments from those figures have been fairly damning, where Bolton referred to Giuliani essentially as a hand grenade, and this whole weapon aid for investigations deal as quote unquote a drug deal, in the words of counterpart Dr. Fiona Hill, which was the NSC's Russia expert. But then in Giuliani's case, he's constantly appearing in the media, admitting to quid pro quo one moment and then saying that it's not illegal on the other, which just goes into sort of grayness that Congress will be grappling with when it comes to the limits of presidential power. But in terms of any surprises, anything is possible. As we move over into it's good, the fact that we're going now into public proceedings that are going to make it more significant. We're going to start seeing it on television, and it gives a chance for members of Congress to be essentially them preaching to the desired audience, the Democrats to the American public, and then the Republicans to their audience of one, Donald Trump.
I will cut you off. I'm sorry about that. The time has gotten the best of us, but we do sincerely, of course, appreciate your time, of course, and Sascha and Brian's time as well, speaking to us today, and of course, bringing this issue into context for us. Public proceedings, as all of our guests there said, are set to begin soon into this impeachment process. We'll keep a very close eye on that, because that may very well hold a lot more revelations about Donald Trump's activities as president, and the Trump administration's, of course, dealings with worldwide leaders as well, and this issue over Ukraine and quid pro quo. We'll stay with that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's program, we're going to discuss hate crimes within the United States, which, as we well know, have been increasing. The statistics show that over these number of years. Many people would argue these hate crimes have always occurred, of course, but it's just that statistics now and the records are now more specific and organized at this time. We're going to use as a case study a case coming out of Milwaukee, where police there have said they've arrested a man, a 61-year-old, I believe, who is suspected of throwing battery acid on a Hispanic man, who is also an American citizen, by the way. And the Hispanic man says the attacker told him, and this was over a parking dispute, mind you, and he questioned him, "Why did you come here and invade my country?" Now, of course, that's an attitude which even the president of the United States has many times reflected, Donald Trump specifically. Is this just a reflection then of how America and many countries around the world, even in Europe possibly, are changing their attitudes towards immigrants and even those who are citizens but are of minority and different ethnicities? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Rashawn Ray, who is the Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. He is joining us now from Washington, D.C. Rashawn, as always, we appreciate your time this morning. What do you make of this case coming out of Milwaukee? Certainly very disturbing, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. It's very disturbing. And it harkens back actually to an early 1980s case, 1982, when Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese immigrant, was murdered by two manufacturing workers in Michigan. And that was at the time anti-Asian, specifically anti-Japanese sentiment. They confused him as being Japanese. I think in this case, it's not just about being Hispanic, that the person who did this assault, who threw this acid on this man, probably assumed that he was Mexican. And at the end of the day, what it has to deal with is group threat. So in social psychology, we talk about group threat theory. This is when there's a sizable population, oftentimes an immigrant population, who poses an economic, political, and or cultural threat. And so in many regards, we are seeing that this is an economic threat, that people are perceiving that Hispanics are coming over, taking their jobs. And this has been something that has existed for decades and decades, even as we go back to the Mexican-American War.
Rashawn, a lot of people, as you well know, will point to just Donald Trump and say, listen, he's allowed for this. But is it ever as simple as just blaming this one president?
Well, it's never as simple as blaming one person. But I do think in this case, there is a significant correlation. In places where Donald Trump campaigned in 2016, hate crimes in the United States increased over 200%. What this means is if you had a place that had 10 hate crimes the previous year, the next year you had 30. If you had a place that had 50 hate crimes, you now have 150, and so forth and so on. And so what I think that's interesting is that hate crimes overall across the United States from 2016 to 2017 in particular increased about 20%. Anti-Hispanic sentiment in the United States, hate crimes increased 25%. So, I mean, we are seeing some huge increases in hate crimes. And I do think that Donald Trump's rhetoric is driving that. But the other part that's driving it as well is the fact that a lot of these sentiments are things that people have already held. It's not like he's putting something new onto them. Instead, what he's doing is he's giving them at times a license to act with their behaviors. And in acting with their behavior, we see a direct link between people's racist attitudes and then their behaviors that actually lead to hate crimes. And what we need in the United States are stricter hate crime laws. When it comes to, say, the Vincent Chin incident that I mentioned from the 1980s, the two men who did that got a $3,000 fine and a 3-year probation for murdering someone. And so you're essentially giving someone $3,000 to murder someone. With hate crimes, we are still seeing that today, that the penalty for hate crimes are extremely low in the United States, and it needs to be something that the federal government takes a bit more seriously.
I wonder, though, Rashawn, as you said, many of these things that are coming out right now are beliefs that people hold, deep down in their hearts, some of them at least, the racist, that is. Isn't it better to deal with those beliefs head on than to just tell them, don't say it out loud?
Yes, of course. I mean, at the end of the day, we definitely want to deal with people's attitudes, but beliefs are very, very difficult to change. What's more important to particularly deal with is policy. And so we have to actually implement policy that tells people, the American public or the public of any nation, that certain types of behaviors will not be tolerated. So in the United States, of course, free speech is something that is held extremely high. But verbalizing something and stating something is quite different from acting something out in a person's behavior. When you start defaming structures and buildings, when you start harming people. And so part of what it is that oftentimes people's attitudes lag behind policy change. If we go back to the 1950s and 60s, and of course, there's still strong anti-Black sentiment in the United States. But of course, in the 50s and 60s, during the Civil Rights Movement, it was even higher. Policy led that change. And then people's attitudes started to change after that. Now, oftentimes they coincide. Of course, you have a strong base who are engaging in oftentimes counter-protest and counter-messaging. But overall, policy needs to lead the way and tell people that this type of behavior is not going to be tolerated and it's not going to be a slap on the wrist.
And so I'm also, Rashawn, that this discourages, at some level, I haven't seen statistics on this in this regard, maybe you have, but, about people immigrating then to the U.S. I mean, I imagine that many people around the world would look at this situation as it's playing out right now in the U.S., within context, of course, and per capita, but would not be very encouraged to want to immigrate there, especially if they fall under a minority category, which isn't very much liked at this point in time by the majority.
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that might even outweigh the perception that a person could be a victim of a hate crime is economic opportunity. And most of the time, one of the reasons why people are coming to the United States is because of economic opportunity. People are also coming as refugees, as asylum seekers. And so it becomes about relative comparisons. People are comparing what I might experience in the United States versus what I'm currently experiencing in my current country, in my home country. And I think at times the perception of the American dream can outweigh these perceptions that they might be victims of a hate crime. But I definitely think that that depending on the country that a person is coming from and the economic stability of that country and the crime in that country definitely will be related to how people perceive coming to the United States and staying in the United States. And I think it's one line of research that really speaks to your point. Research shows that first generation immigrants, so people who moved to the United States, who were born in another country and lived in that other country, they come to the United States, they think that America is great. But by the time they get older and by the time they have children, their outcomes become similar to other minority groups. So African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, their outcomes become similar to Black Americans. Hispanic immigrants, their outcomes become similar to Latinos. And part of this deals with racial angst and discrimination that ethnic minorities experience in the United States. So it becomes very clear that this is about what people are experiencing in the United States. It's not just something that's in their heads.
Interesting. So I wonder then going forward then, if we're trying to deal with this situation, what does that entail? I mean, obviously the president is who he is. He says what he says. What can you and I, for example, myself sitting outside, but you sitting within the U.S. and others there within U.S. borders itself, what can they do to deal with the situation? Because, it only seems that wherever we're seeing hate, so we're talking about anti-Semitism as well, we're talking about Islamophobia as well, talking about, of course, police brutality, not just towards a specific group of people, but specifically and more importantly towards the African-American community within the U.S. I mean, the list is really endless. So do these communities then need to unite? Is that what needs to happen? Is that happening enough?
I think that there are definitely some groups and people who are trying. I mean, I think there are a few things. So I have written about a racial equity framework that I developed. And with this framework, there are three things that people can do specifically. First, people can become racial equity learners. These are people who would say, view this particular segment and learn more about the prominence of hate crime. So learning how prominent some of these incidents are. Second, they can then become racial equity allies. I tend to think that a lot of times that people's attitudes go unchecked, and then those attitudes lead to detrimental behaviors. What I mean by that is, in the United States, the holidays are coming up. This is the big holiday season in the United States and in other parts around the world. And people's families and friends are going to be sitting around the table. And there's always someone's bigoted uncle or racist aunt or a sexist uncle who's going to make a comment. And oftentimes our silence becomes our acceptance. And so second, what we have to do is we have to become racial equity allies and speak up and speak out when someone says something racist, particularly someone in our own families. That can be a very powerful counter messaging. And then third, we need to become racial equity advocates. These are people who advocate for equitable policies in their workplaces. And these equitable policies actually oftentimes deal with making sure that people are held accountable for their actions. This doesn't just happen at the federal level with stronger hate crime laws or at the state level. As an example, Second Army Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III, who was murdered at the University of Maryland in a hate crime, his foundation has been pushing for stronger hate crime legislation in the state of Maryland, and hopefully that'll be an example around the country. And so being a racial equity advocate means being at your company, at your homeowners association, in your own neighborhood, at your workplace, and advocating for equitable policies and advocating for policies that really hold people accountable for mistreating others so that we show that we don't tolerate this.
We'll have to leave it there at that, Rashawn, but of course, that's a very good point to actually end off on that point of racial equity. We'll, of course, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out and sharing your insight with us. As Rashawn, their viewers, was mentioning about racial equity, that's a very good point and a very good approach, I think, to the situation where you need to call out people when there is any racism expressed. And that's very tough to do, certainly. It's not an easy task, specifically when those beliefs have been long held or even held for generations in some specific families possibly as well, or even within company structures, etc. Because the situation within the U.S. borders is becoming, significantly worrying for many minorities. As I said, the list only seems to be increasing on a daily basis of the minorities and even American citizens who are being attacked just because of their skin color or otherwise. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope, and no doubt this is not the last time we'll be discussing about this issue as well. But I've been Waqar Rizvi, coming to you from Toronto. Thank you for watching.